Inspiration for Teachers Podcast, bringing you dynamic and inspirational educator interviews. Our fascinating guests share their professional challenges and creative resolutions for success. Discover their workable strategies, ideas, and resources to reach your educational goals. And now your host, Kelly Long.
Welcome to another episode of Inspiration for Teachers. I'm your host, Kelly Long, and I'm super thrilled to be joined alongside our dynamic educator on the show, Bill Lucas. Bill is Director of the Centre for Real World Learning and Professor of Learning at the University of Winchester here in the UK. Bill is known internationally as a speaker on the subjects of learning, change, creativity and leadership. He is a prolific writer and has authored and co-authored over 40 books. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thank you, Kelly.
Before we dive into your educational challenge of fostering environments for learning where students can think for themselves, who can be innovative, experimental and who can be disruptive and allowed to fail, what I'd like to do is give you a moment to say hello to our listeners and fill in the blanks from the intro.
So as Kelly said, I am Director of the Centre for Real World Learning, but that takes about half of my week because I'm an applied researcher. So I'm only really interested if I can be working with people in different contexts, and the two or maybe three contexts I'm especially interested in are education, health, and the creative arts more generally, and creativity more generally. So I find myself in the very happy position of going all over the world. I was in Australia last week working with the state of Victoria, and that was a school focus. But a few weeks before that, I was in Sweden working with wonderful, dynamic, talented medics and psychologists trying to improve the Swedish healthcare system.
Wow, so you are super busy, Bill, and you must get a real unique perspective on what's going on around the world in terms of education. So you'll be able to give us a really good insight right now into our next question, which is to look at what is most important when it comes to teaching and learning. Could you just dissect that for a moment and, in your opinion, tell us what the most powerful strategy or tool a teacher has in the toolkit to aid learning?
There's not just one, but teaching and learning is fundamentally a process that requires good relationships. So the most important thing is the quality of the relationship between the teacher and pupils and pupils and pupils and pupils and teacher. And indeed, I'd extend that out to the family and all those who care for the child in question. So in a school context, it's absolutely relationships. Within that relationship, there needs to be a really well orchestrated way of looking forward, of setting goals, of looking inside self and hanging on to self-belief and having a can-do view of the future. And as you do everything, there needs to be a really powerful real-time feedback system that is, as Ron Berger puts it, specific and kind, because it's no good being unkind and it's no good being vague. And then as you go through your learning journey, there need to be all sorts of ways of reflecting on the experience of learning. So relationship, feedback, and then beyond that, I think, and we may come on to this as we talk about our main topic, that will suggest certain kinds of pedagogy, certain kinds of teaching and learning methods, which are going to be most suited to whatever you're doing. And remember, there's always a question above what makes really good learning, and that is learning for what, or schooling for what, or education for what. So if you're trying to create a certain kind of child or doctor or manager, then you're going to be using certain methods. And if your output or outcome desired is something else, then that's going to take you down a different path.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that with us, Bill. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip onto a different question where we find out from you what most excites you about education right now, and also the flip side of that, which is what would you most like to change and why?
Okay, what excites me? I'm particularly thrilled that teachers the world over are recognizing that, as well as being fabulous teachers, and they're very much in the news and they're very much taking flack, I feel, at the moment. I personally hate the idea being the word being used by our current Secretary of State of schools as coasting schools. I think it's unkind and unhelpful. So teachers are in the center of a real storm, but they're acting up magnificently, and many of them are taking their future in their own hands, and they're either going back to university, or they're creating professional learning communities, or they're undertaking tests of change in their own institution, or they're working across institutions with colleagues in other schools and colleges. And I think that generosity of spirit that I see at the moment in the teaching profession has never been higher, and I'm very excited by that. I think the second thing that gets me out of bed at the moment is that although the forces of conservatism with a small c always come back to the simple things that politicians can do, and politicians can change the exam or change the form of the school. Those are the simple things that politicians always go for, or they can fund well or fund less well schools. I'm seeing now that across the world, not yet in England, but there are signs of it in Scotland, and it's still alive in Northern Ireland, less so in Wales. I'm seeing signs of educators who are prepared to ask and answer the tricky questions. And the really tricky question is, what are we doing all this for? And if we want to produce young people who are young men and women of character, who are able to learn whatever a tricky world will throw at them, and of course who can succeed in whichever exam system they find themselves in, then that will take us into a different view of school and a different view of education from the one that is sometimes the one we read about in the popular press. And I see the signs of that beginning to happen. It's not there yet, but it's beginning to happen. And the third thing I think is exciting is that the learning sciences, the set of disciplines I look to with greatest interest, are really beginning to gain some traction. So, for example, Carol Dweck is the thinker of our day at the moment, but Carol's been applying her research trade for 4 decades, and she's been talking about complex ideas to do with learner self-belief, learner a sense of self-efficacy, learner agency. And it's only in the last 10 years when she wrote a popular book, Mindset, and when she began to make connections with educators in the school system, don't forget she's a Stanford academic, that we've really seen a terrific interest in her work. And of course, that's opened up a real interest in other people's work in this particular area, just of self-image. So Malcolm Gladwell, Lauren Resnick at Harvard, all the group around Project Zero. Ron Richard, David Perkins, Howard Gardner. Howard Gardner's been in the consciousness for his idea of multiple intelligences, but this is different. This is a group of thinkers who are showing in a very real and practical way how you think of your own talent can really impact on your likelihood of success. And parallel to them, there are some more detailed architects of what it is that we do in the classroom and the workshop and the studio. And they're people like Ron Berger, whose much watched YouTube clip on Austin's Butterfly is a powerful reminder of the importance of seeing mistakes as our friends, of doing multiple drafts, of overcoming the kind of Homer Simpson throwaway, it's good enough world in which some people live, and in which, of course, some teenagers are afflicted by, because they're not just creators of culture, they're recipients of culture. And there are probably a dozen other individual thinkers I could mention, and almost all of them have the capacity. My dear friend and colleague Guy Claxon would come into that category. They have the capability of thinking bold ideas, putting them to the research test, and the ability to communicate them in engaging ways, and then not stopping there, but building communities of practice across schools and colleges where others can really make them their own. So they're very exciting times to be alive, I think.
I was going to take you back, Bill, actually, because you said something really interesting about what the science is and the research is showing us. And you were saying about how long it's taken for Carol Dweck's message to come across and be embedded within schools. And there seems to be a real issue between what the science and the research shows and it actually being implemented in the classroom. There seems to be a huge gap between us doing that. What do you think are some of the solutions to taking what were discovering, what all those researchers that you've just mentioned are discovering, and actually implementing it with the classroom teacher in a working school environment?
Well, good question. And this translational gap or translational lag is not just confined to education. You can see it just as trenchantly in health. And I need to probably just unpack your question a bit, because I think it's never been the case that somebody can write something good and then somebody else somewhere else can do something that replicates the ideas in whatever's been written. So the idea that simply by knowing something or writing something you can do something better is flawed. That's why when we think about the education of young people, we have to constantly come back to thinking about the actual dispositions that young people show rather than the skills that they may have available to be tested at a particular period in their educational trajectory. So we need to understand how change happens, and we need to be aware, as thinkers like Dylan William and Michael Fullan for two have made us aware, that it takes time, it takes practice, it takes kindness, it takes genuine, safe opportunities to experiment. It requires teachers to have the kind of evaluative techniques that enable them to know whether the change that they're implementing is a change for the benefit of learners or not. And so it requires a general heightening of the skill levels amongst our teaching colleagues for their evaluative processes. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, and that it's one of the drivers behind the International Expansive Education Network. So the simple answer to your question, Kelly, is that translating research is not simple. And translation always involves human beings who may not want to do what you want them to do. And most importantly, in the English context, who may feel that the pressure of Ofsted, of the new EBAC, of the new tests in the early stage of Key Stage 3 in literacy and numeracy, of the threat of reintroduction of tests, not the SATs at Key Stage 2, all of this exerts a very powerful pressure which can be construed as negative. It isn't negative in and of itself, but it doesn't half put, I think, relentless and probably, to use this word again, unkind pressure on the leaders of these institutions, because it makes the risk of experimentation much greater. And we need our teachers to experiment. How on earth would Edison have discovered a light bulb if he'd not experimented constantly? How would any engineer have made any progress, or any artist or any scientist come up with a breakthrough discovery if they hadn't had the opportunity, again, we'll come back to this later, to fail, and to fail repeatedly, but to bounce back from that. So we've just got to understand that these things are complex. That's why we're teachers. That's why it's a noble profession. And we've got to invest the time and care and structure and organisation to ensure that teacher communities can take these ideas to the kind of classroom a little bit more quickly than in the past.
And that's what makes teaching very exciting, being able to take those ideas and experiment with them and reflect on the process and discover what actually works. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, Bill, and breaking down that very huge question. But we're going to shift the focus now, and we're going to move our conversation to your thought-provoking ideas on learning. But before we do, I just want to remind our listeners that they can find Bill's show notes on our podcast page at inspirationforteachers.com. We'll also be tweeting out key themes related to this podcast episode, so you can follow those at Inspiration4T. That's the number 4 and a capital T. So, Bill, please can you take us on this journey with you and just set the scene for our listeners of what fostering environments for learning should look like, and how we can encourage students to think for themselves and be innovative.
Okay, over the next few minutes, I'll try and sketch in some of the key pillars of the approach that I think, or the approaches that we might like to take. So remember, what I'm trying to do is explore the context and elements of a culture, the features of practice which will foster an environment for learning where students can think for themselves, can innovate, and can fail. In short, what I'm trying to do is to construct a learning environment which will engage learners who will then become capable of demonstrating the kind of dispositions which will enable them to thrive in a complex world. And they'll not just do that, but they'll also, along the way, pick up their necessary examinations, their necessary passports to the next stage of whatever educational journey they choose to go on. This is, and we'll come on to this again later, this is essentially the argument of the book that Guy Claxton and I have recently published, Educating Ruby, What Our Children Really Need to Learn. And whilst not straying into that argument, I think it's important to say that the first and most important thing that we need all to do is to name the other outcomes of school. The government names the main outcomes of school, and they're things called English and maths and science and all those other normally high status exam results if you're in a general educational route. If you're in a college or in a more vocational pathway, there'll be things like apprenticeship and other higher technical qualifications, just as important in my view as the GCSEs and A-levels and possibly international baccalaureate if you're going down that route. So the first thing is, as I was saying, we have to name these. We have to be quite explicit that the purpose of school is twofold. It's, of course, the passport function, the enabling of young people to get their clutch of whatever exams, whatever regime you're in, values. It would be morally repugnant of teachers not to do that. But secondly, there is at least as important a game, if you like, and that is to equip young men and women with the capabilities that they'll need to be effective learners for the rest of their life. And by effective learners, I don't just mean the kind of things that you'd expect good learners to be able to do, to collaborate with others, to keep going when life gets tricky, to be creative, to keep their curiosity going and all of those things. I also mean good people. So there's a sense in which there's a moral, there is a powerful moral element of what we're doing as teachers. So we need all the while to be thinking about the ethical dimensions of what we're doing, the kindness with which children work with others, their degree, the ways in which they're able to understand perspectives that aren't their own, and perhaps even perspectives with which they disagree strongly. So job number one is to be absolutely clear that there are these two games of school, and we need to, because the exam game, it has its names, we have to provide the names for the other game. Interestingly, our own Secretary of State, Nicky Morgan, has realised that. That's partly what is driving her initiatives on character. And very interesting, the CBI Director General, John Cridland, last week calling for a crusade to develop young people who have character and resilience, which is a lovely backhanded compliment for the work that I and Guy and others in our broader movement have been doing. The second thing I think we need to do is to create a broader professional community in which these kinds of other desired outcomes of education can be allowed to flourish. And that's why about 6 years ago, Guy and I created the Expansive Education Network. And for your listeners, it's very easy to find. If you Google it, it'll pop up first, but it's www.expansiveeducation.net. And when you arrive at that site, you'll immediately see that it's a virtual community, like the one that you've created, Kelly. And that's important. But as you penetrate the site, you'll also see that it's a network of organizations across the world who share the values that have led me to give that long exposition about what the other game of school is. So they're people who want great mathematicians who are also wonderful problem solvers, fabulous historians who are also capable of showing high degrees of empathy, wonderful athletes who are able to set their own goals and deal with mistakes when things don't go quite as well as they'd hoped for, and so forth. And the community, therefore, celebrates and constantly tries to put into practice a set of ideals. The first one of which I've dwelt on at some length, and that's the expansion. They're all playful explorations of the word expand or expanding. So expanding the goals of education into these other desirable outcomes. The second expansion, it has been implicit in what I've been saying so far, and that is an expansion into the notion of what it is to be intelligent itself. In other words, drawing on the work of Carol Dweck, of Lauren Resnick, and of many, many others, showing that we must not give in too quickly. We must maintain our inner belief, but most importantly, we must have the strategies to practice, to keep going when we get stuck, and so forth, so that intelligence itself is, in a very real way, expandable. The third area, which I haven't touched on at all, but which I suspect your listeners again will find sympathy with, is that the expansion needs to be geographical. It's obvious that some young people have less of a good start in their homes than some other young people. It's equally obvious that young people are only at school for about a quarter of the time that they're at home, or at least their waking hours over the year. Therefore, engaging with parents and carers and family members and community members in a much more meaningful way in supporting the learning journey of young people is part of what makes this environment where students can think for themselves and are innovative, because it's going to immediately transcend the walls of school. And the final part of this, which I'll kind of keep to one side, but it's important to remember, is an expansion for the role of the teacher. And the teacher, of course, teaches good lessons and is a good role model and all of those things, but also, we know, needs, for the very highest possible learner outcomes, needs himself or herself to continue learning. And that means research with a small r, that means action research in the expansive education network, or sometimes referred to as professional inquiry, something increasingly common across the world. You can't progress up the professional spine in Scotland unless you're undertaking your own professional inquiry. And that's the case in a number of states and countries across the world. So those are the four pillars of this network. But the elements of the network are much simpler, and they are the permission thoughtfully to experiment within a values-driven space that is always going to be looking for the evidence of others, of researchers with a large R, what the Carol Dwecks of this world have come up with, but also the evidence of their own eyes and ears as they make small tests of change in their own classroom. And the Expansive Education Network is a repository of the reports of teachers who have done that. It's a place where case studies from across the world of schools and colleges which have gone down this route can be published. It's a place where resources that may support you in the journey can be curated and can be made really, really accessible. So number one, you need to name your desired outcomes of education, and they need to be broader than just exams. Number two, you need to create an environment in which a professional learning environment in which teachers can learn or relearn this craft. Number three, you need some bravery, because at the moment, the climate will require you to say, do you know what? This is really important. And as well as delivering whatever you're asking us to deliver, you out there, and by you out there, I normally mean government or Ofsted or both, we also are absolutely steadfast that we believe in these things and we're going to deliver these things too. Now, in the classroom, back to my very first answer to you on what makes a good teacher, it's all going to come down to relationships. So the most powerful thing that teachers can do if they're trying to create an environment for learning where students can think for themselves and are innovative and can fail is to model that. There's nothing more powerful, is there, than the adults in the space doing and demonstrating in a real and reliable way precisely the target dispositions that they're talking about valuing in their students. There's nothing more dissonant, is there, than a teacher who is talking about the virtues of resilience and persistence who goes to pieces at the first sign of their technology failing. That will give a mixed message, and it'll always be the action rather than the espoused words which the students will remember. The next thing that needs to happen is that the curriculum, within the constraints, whether you're at primary or secondary, the curriculum needs to be configured in such a way that it is possible to collaborate beyond individual disciplines some of the time. That it is possible to have sustained experiences of learning that don't just start and end with a bell that marks the passage of 1 hour. That might be a whole morning or a whole day or even in some cases a whole week. And that these are regular, they're not weird. They're not just festivals, or they're not just what we do at the end of year when we can't think of anything else to do. These are an integral part of the school day. And there are lots of schools. Many of the UTCs I've visited are doing this. It's their way of being. The RSA Academy group are doing this. I've seen at first hand how effective it can be. And there are many, many schools in the expansive education network where part of the curriculum diet is not accessed through the portal of a subject label, but through a really cracking question. Something that is really engaging, something that is really relevant to the experiences of young people. And then, unsurprisingly, as we're teachers and they're learners, we need fully to understand the full breadth of teaching and learning methods at our disposal. And in the book that charts the stories of schools across the world, this is Expansive Education, Teaching Learners for the Real World, we explore 10 different continua, if you like, from which questions will arise for teachers to consider how they're going to organise their classroom, which teaching and learning methods they're going to use. And they're questions such as the nature of activities, the degree to which they're going to be authentic, the attitude to knowledge, the degree to which questioning is stage centre, the means of knowing, how much theory and how much practice, the organisation of time, how much it is extended or bell-bound, the organisation of space. Too often we default to the classroom in rows rather than the workshop, and so forth. And of all of those questioning areas, the work of John Hattie is never far away, because whatever decisions we take, then as the trilogy of his well-known books makes clear, the visibility of the learning processes is going to be critically important. And in trying to foster an environment for learning where students think for themselves, we're bound to choose teaching and learning methods that are going to be inquiry-led, rigorous project-driven, that are going to require autonomous and collaborative working as part of it, that are not going to be over-packaged and over-neatened up, but are going to leave plenty of space for young people to explore. They're going to require an assessment regime and a feedback series of loops which make it absolutely normal for kids to make mistakes. And instead of everybody going to pieces, actually teach groups to critique each other's work, as Ron Berger has shown so effectively. So that we have, if I can imagine this starting in primary, the assumption that when you've done something, it's absolutely normal to share it with your friend who's going to give you kind, specific feedback. And then you share it more widely and you share it with your home and friends, and it's constantly evolving. So the notion of learning that we're sharing is of one in which it is complex, it is tricky, it's a journey, it's a process. We make mistakes, we revisit things, but we're constantly making progress. We're constantly seeking to improve whatever it is we're seeking to do. And the final bit of this jigsaw, final sounds too neat. It's not as neat as this, of course, but really powerfully, we need to engage students, pupils, learners, whatever the noun is that is your preferred one. And we need to engage them wherever possible as our allies, as our collaborators, as our co-designers, but not in a way that's irresponsible. We need to recruit them to benefit from their ideas, to have them notice what others are doing, to give them really competence-enhancing projects. I would like every sixth form student to have to do a practical project as well as their A-levels. That's beyond the very excellent projects that exist at A-level right now. I would like throughout school life there to be a requirement that we're expecting both academic and more practical and vocational experiences to be enjoyed and explored. We don't know exactly where these young people are going to end up, and we don't know, whatever they end up earning their crust from, may not be what gives them greatest personal pleasure. So we need to remember that broader humanistic power of education. So finding students who, instead of, if they gather together in a student council, are feverishly talking about how many times in a week they're going to have chips in the canteen, they're actually engaging with the teaching and learning methods, the curriculum, what's on offer, how they can improve it, how they can engage with local business and communities and families. And there are plenty of schools that are doing this. It's not at all impossible. And the expansive education network, the expansive education frame that I put round all of this, will also assume that no one organisation has the answers. So it'll be open, it'll be outward looking, it'll be encouraging the best organisations across the world, often in Skype time, just as we're talking now from one part of the world to another. So we can do this in our classrooms. We can really, and it's not just about whether you flip the classroom. That's a very simple, linear question. It's a question of how you let asynchronously or at the same time voices from across the world into your classroom, which I think we need to do more of. And very powerfully, all the way through all of this, is the fourth pillar of the expansive education idea. That's to say we are reflective. We as teachers, students as students, are noticing better what is happening. John Hattie talks quite a lot about better noticing, and I think he's absolutely right. We need to equip students, parents, teachers, school leaders, all those who are responsible for commissioning anything in education with a set of evaluative skills, both quantitative and qualitative, so they can really begin to figure out whether or not what's going on in school is delivering the outcomes of the kind that we want. And we absolutely do want kids who can think for themselves and are innovative and can fail, because that's what employers want. It's what psychologists want. It's what most parents want. It's what anybody with a mind and a heart and a brain wants, because those are the kind of capabilities, plus all the social ones that are implicit, the collaborative capabilities as well, plus that kind of commitment and collaboration that's implied if you do a job really well, that we need in our learners in this tricky second decade of the 21st century. Sorry, that was a very long paragraph, Kelly, but I hope that begins to unpack it.
It does, Bill. And you've left me with so many ideas in my head that I'm thinking, right, I'm going to do this the next time I go into my classroom and start planning in a new way. But there were two things that really stick in my mind. The first one is to do with the professional learning environment that schools should be creating. And one thing that I'd quite like you to just delve into is, when we're creating a model for that, how structured or unstructured should that environment for learning be? And the reason that I'm asking that is because there has to be a certain amount of autonomy involved in that process. You've got to want to find out about it. You've got to want to put in the effort to do the research. So how structured should it be? Because I can imagine if it's really structured and really nailed down, it could put quite a lot of teachers off from wanting to do it. So what would you say is a good model that you have come across or that you've seen in your learning environment that you would say, I think this is good and maybe this is worth investigating?
Well, it's a good question. And schools that do this really well tend to spend some time opening up the kind of bigger questions that I was exploring, like what's the point of school and what else other than exam results do we want here? And then they look out with colleagues and they look at some of the research that seems to be most pertinent to their sort of areas. And then they sort of triangulate it back to the aims of the school or the college. And all the while and this is the metaphor we use with our action researchers, you're operating in a funnel. You're starting with a very big world of possibility and you're consensually and iteratively bringing it into a place where you can, most schools you can find consensus about the broad area or areas of inquiry. And most teachers will accept that, but as you're implying, will also want some wriggle room and some opportunity for their own individuality. And we would suggest very strongly that this works best when they have just that. So that within an agreed, consensually arrived at set of priorities, and they might be our priorities for this year or this term or whatever. So there's always going to be, well, I'll do that next term, or I'll do this now, but I'll wait until next year. Then within that, encouraging innovation, encouraging creativity. Exactly, back to what I was saying, if we want kids to be creative and innovative, we have to expect and encourage staff to be that too. So always rewarding those people who want to be a divergent voice, but recognizing that you can do that in a way that isn't disruptive. You can do that in a way that is creative and contributive rather than distracting. And those schools that get this right know how to tread this. There's not a science of this, I think. It's more of an art. This blend of direction but individuality. And I think one can talk oneself into making this seem like far more of a problem than it actually is. Good schools have to take this kind of decision about almost everything that they do, and professional learning is no different. But I know, and the question that you asked implies this, that if you want the full curiosity and engagement of teachers, you need to give them their head and trust them as individuals. So you need to imbue this space with real trust. It needs to be a grown-up space in which teachers are treated like adults and encouraged and supported and given a bit of slack and flex.
Thanks, Bill. And the other thing that I wanted you just to clarify for us is that framework for learning seems to be shifting, and it seems to be getting more and more exciting, but we seem to be moving into a new phase of education and teaching and learning. Now, compared to when I did my teacher training, which was 10 years ago, I can already see the shift. But for teachers that have been out of the training environment for a while, taking that risk of encouraging them to focus on the process of learning as opposed to getting students straight from A to B, that's quite a big risk. So especially when, in the background, you've got the pressures of, well, we've got to get them certain exam results, and the quickest way to do that probably is bypassing the process of learning. How do you go about encouraging schools and teachers to take that risk and really look at that process of learning? You were talking about feedback and being reflective, but how do you get them to make that shift forward?
Well, again, a good observation, good question. I'd agree with you. I think there is a group within schools that is a disempowered group that probably started with the literacy and numeracy strategies and has deepened ever since. And it's there's only one way of doing this. There's only one real outcome that matters here, and that's the subgrades improvement that I'm going to achieve. And I personally think that's such a limited view of education. When we look back and write the history of this period, this last decade will seem very dull indeed, I suspect. But in terms of managing it, we have to recognize it. And all good leaders start by being open and honest and saying, I'm conscious that a lot of you feel a lot of pressure, and a lot of you have been in a professional environment where you've not had this opportunity and where you've not perhaps had the chance to focus on process. So we're now going to build, and it's not a short-term fix. It's going to take us 2 or 3 years to get where we need to get to. And we're going to build the climate in our school or in our clusters of school or in our academy chain, whatever your kind of institutional frame is. We're going to build that community where people can do this. And it'll involve coaching and mentoring and modeling and professional learning of a kind that isn't just we're going to flood the place with experts or have one-off days on this or that or the other. So it needs to have senior and middle leaders who really see this as the day job. Just as we know that we need to focus on effort and learning strategy with students, so we need to focus on teaching strategy and engagement with teachers. And there's no shortcut, Kelly. We've just got to do this, and there are plenty of schools that are showing how this is doable. But I think you just have to start with the moment of honesty that recognizes that not all your teachers will yet, don't forget the power of not yet, have the capabilities they need, but they will get them.
Well, I think it's such an exciting time for education, and to be a teacher, with all the research that's going on and all the steps forward we can make, I think it's a really empowering time. So thank you so much for sharing that with us, Bill. So now let's switch it up a little bit, and we're going to move on to our inspiration round, Bill. It's an opportunity for us to explore your best education resources and add some more value to educators. Can you share with us your proudest moments?
Gosh, there are so many of them. They tend to be moments where I've seen young people or colleagues doing things that I didn't know they were capable of doing. I think that's probably the common strand to them. And in parallel to that, insofar as the pride is personal, they're where I've been able to play some small part in taking complex ideas and making them accessible to others, and then coming back to whatever that community was, a year or in some cases 10 years, or in one case I started an organization called Learning Through Landscapes that is 25 years old almost to the month, and to see the incredible journey that group of educators passionate about the outdoors and experiential learning have been through. So those kind of things really turn me on.
That's fantastic. And can you share with us now the best advice you've ever received?
I think in a funny sort of way, I posthumously, because he's dead sadly, admire my dad, who was ahead. And the best advice he gave me was not to talk about education. And he modelled that by, he would talk, of course, if I asked him about his job, but he never tried to persuade me to become a teacher. And indeed, as a son of an educationalist, I knew there was only one thing I was certain about in life, and that was I would never be a teacher. But of course, I failed, and within minutes of coming down from university and being broke and going to teach on a European summer school, I'd got the bug. And so I think sometimes the best advice you can get is not verbal. It's either by an absence of explicit thou shalts, or it's by the role modelling of the person around you. In terms of giving advice, it isn't quite the same question. I know that I've evolved a form of words which I find really helpful with children and young adults and colleagues, older colleagues, and that is, rather than ever telling anybody anything, framing it in the sentence, you might like to. Because if you give advice in that form, in that frame, it allows people to think, and do you know what, Bill? I might like not to. So it leaves the kind of dignity of individual expression intact.
So what are your sources of inspiration?
Millions, no, thousands, hundreds. I'm in my wall, in my book-lined study at home as we have this conversation, and lots of them are psychologists. Lots of them are in the States. So I've mentioned some: Carol Dweck, Lauren Resnick, David Perkins, Ellen Langer. In the North America, Michael Fullan. In the UK, my friend Guy Claxton, Dylan William, a very analytical, thoughtful Institute of Education researcher, Chris Watkins. I really like the work that people like Louise Stoll have done on learning communities. There are so many. I love Ron Berger's work on developing craft. I love Lois Hetland's work on studio teaching. I could. John Hattie is unsurprisingly a big influence. I think he above all has managed to cut through the research confusion to be able to say things that are true and simple enough and useful enough for colleagues. And parent educators. I'm a big fan of Joyce Epstein, of Alma Harris, of Charles DeForge, of Karen Mapp, Ann Henderson. There are never a day, Ken Robinson, never a day goes by without me reading something. And it might be an educational or psychological text, or it might be a novel. I'm a big fan and a big friend of Philip Pullman, who he and I taught together in Oxford at one stage of our life, and we're both very much involved in Pegasus Theatre, and I have a very passionate belief in the arts and drama, and I often take inspiration from novels, so the list is endless. There just aren't enough hours in the day for me to name the kinds of myriad inspirations I can see out there.
We could build a little directory just off the ones you showed with us there, Bill. So can you share with us a teaching or education habit that has worked for you time and again that you think might add value to others in our field?
Well, I'm going to go back to the you might like to, because I think there comes a moment when you try and persuade somebody to do something, And I think that frame is very powerful because it requires you to think, to listen, to be clear about a sense of direction, but respectful of the person that you're working with.
And do you have a resource that you can share with our listeners that you think would add value to them in their daily practice?
Well, I'm going to choose the book that Guy Claxton and I've just finished and is out there. And I'm thrilled to say this is Educating Ruby, What Our Children Really Need to Learn. And Ruby, as we've affectionately named our book, sold out its first print run in the first month. And that's never happened to either of us. So it is dangerously close to being a popular book, which is exactly what we wanted it to be. If you've ever seen or remember seeing the play or the film Educating Rita, you'll remember how the sassy, forthright Rita drives a wedge through the complacency of higher education at that time. And our Ruby is similarly Ruby we imagine to be Rita's granddaughter. She's somewhere in a school or college near you now, and she's doing similarly. And Ruby has acquired various capabilities, all of which rather conveniently start with the letter C, and they're only starting with the letter C to make them memorable. And they're things like confidence, curiosity, collaboration, communication, creativity, commitment, and craftsmanship. They're this other game of school and life that I was talking about. And Ruby has got those, which is just as well, because we imagine in chapter 3, as one of us might have been a teacher in a school, encountering Ruby after she'd left our school and vaguely seeing her across the street and thinking, gosh, that's Ruby. And then suddenly flooding into our mind a series of memories that didn't include getting very good exam results. And so it's with some diffidence, perhaps, because that's the way we're programmed, that we walk up to Ruby and we extend a handshake and we say, how are you, Ruby? Kind of wondering whether Ruby will maybe even want to talk to us, because perhaps for us, we failed her. But Ruby, or at least our imagined Ruby in our story, is full of all those wonderful attributes that I've been describing. And how she's come by them is, of course, the subject of our book. And that's what we believe all schools and colleges should be empowering kids to develop. Because sadly, we know that for too many young people, school makes them fearful. It makes them unhappy. It makes them unconfident. It makes them retreat within themselves. It doesn't empower their creativity. It doesn't do all the things that we've been talking about. So Ruby is a polemic, is an argument, drawing on research and practice that shows that it is perfectly possible to construct schools that do both, and that we absolutely must do that. And there are, if you like, two kinds of Ruby in the school system who don't do so well, who don't bounce up to greet us and say how they're full of all those wonderful capabilities. And they are type A is the Ruby whom the system almost automatically fails, because by definition a competitive system will only have, in our case, half of the children going through it getting the A's to C's that they apparently need. And so she's a failure in the exam game, and that Ruby, type 1 Ruby, absolutely must acquire those other capabilities. But actually, there's another kind of Ruby who very much has the A stars and goes on probably to rather a good university or college. And there she finds that somewhere during the first term, she has a crushing lack of confidence, maybe even a bout of imposter syndrome. And she realizes that although she's got these shiny exam results, she's never really had the time to think for herself and to develop the inner confidence to make mistakes without blushing. And I'm increasingly conscious of that kind of Ruby, because I think our pressured environment, and we spoke to lots of mothers mainly and kids who fell into that category, boys and girls who were academically successful but hadn't got these other characteristics that we think Ruby, because Ruby is our every woman and our every man, that we think all children, all young people should acquire by the time they leave school. So if your if your listeners are looking for a summer read, it's short, it's incredibly reasonable. I commend Educating Ruby to them.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us, Bill, and a huge personal thanks from me for taking the time to sit down with me and talk about that. But I think we could possibly make a week's worth of podcasts based off what you've just shared. So thank you very much.
Very good. Pleasure.
Just before we say goodbye, how can our listeners connect with you?
All sorts of ways. I'm on Twitter at LucasLearn or at Educating Ruby. Various websites. So the Expansive Education Network website. So Google Expansive Education or Google the Center for Real World Learning. We're top of the Google pile, and you can very easily get my email. And anybody who has that persistence, I always reply to.
Thank you for joining us today on Inspiration for Teachers. For more resources, tips and advice, visit our website, inspirationforteachers.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, we would love to connect with you. Just click like on our Facebook page at facebook.com/inspirationforteachers.